Hello, I'm Bill Goodman, Executive Director of Kentucky Humanities. Welcome to the 2020 Kentucky Book Festival online. We're pleased you've taken the time to join us for this special program that brings together authors, readers, and literary enthusiasts from across the country and the Commonwealth, just like we've done for 39 years. All of our Kentucky Book Festival conversations would not be possible without the generous support of our sponsors. The Kentucky Historical Society is bringing you this program celebrating the 100th anniversary of women's suffrage. Sit back, relax, and enjoy this discussion with Martha S. Jones, Elaine Weiss, and Melanie Goan in conversation with Professor Emeritus from Berea College, Kathy Bullock. Thank you all for being here. Take it away, Kathy.
Thanks, Bill. I am delighted to be here with these phenomenal women, these authors I've just been so excited and riveted by them taking us on a journey back about 100 years and then bringing us back here. So I think as I look through, I see from different vantage points, some of the same story and different aspects of it, and it's quite exciting. So I thought I would ask you first to give us a little background about getting us into the beginning of the story from your perspective. And Elaine, since yours is talking about 1920, riveted, you just bring us right on in there. Talk a little bit about the background out of which this emerged for you.
Sure, thanks, Kathy. Well, I bring the reader to the not the end, but a milepost in the fight for women's voting rights. As we know, it will continue, but I bring them to the last state to ratify the 19th Amendment. So as we know, the movement had been working for decades, more than 7 decades, certainly. And they had made some progress in some states because the vote can be given either by the states. States are in control of election requirements and election procedures. We know that today. And so some states had given women the right to vote. Most had not. For 40 years, a federal amendment, a constitutional amendment, had been stalled in Congress in order to give the constitutional right to vote to women in every state. And it finally passed through Congress in the summer of 1919 and goes out to the states. And in the summer of 1920, 35 states have ratified. 1 more is needed for to have the threshold for ratification. And it turns out to be Tennessee. And so I chronicle the fight for the Tennessee ratification. But in doing so, look back, pull the lens back and look at how women, how the movement had arrived at Tennessee, what had happened before, what were the arguments, what were the issues that they'd been dealing with for decades.
Yes, it really just like, shoom, we go right into 1920, mid-July, what's going on, and stay riveted in the Woman's Hour. Now talk to us, Melanie, because you look specifically from the lens of Kentucky, women in Kentucky, what was going on and bringing us to this same space. Talk to us about the background there or the context.
Well, I follow Elaine's lead, and I start in 1920 also, and then backtrack. And my story begins with the key suffragist from Kentucky, Laura Clay, who was nationally known, very influential in the national movement. And she goes to Tennessee in the summer of 1920, but she goes not to fight to get Tennessee over the finish line and to win ratification. She goes to see it go down in defeat. And so you have this woman who has worked her entire life for this one goal. She's made this into her professional career to see women get the right to vote. Now at the very end of the story, she leaves the suffrage movement and she joins with the people that had always been her foes in this struggle. And so I start there and then backtrack and really look at why Kentucky is important to this story of women winning the vote. And it's not the place we would normally, our mind doesn't go right away to Kentucky when we think of women's suffrage, but Kentucky was very important. Kentucky was seen as the way to open the door for Southern women to begin to consider suffrage, because it was a highly controversial issue all across the country, but even more so in the South, for religious reasons, also very importantly for racial reasons. And so Kentucky as a border state was seen as a place where national suffragists could get kind of an opening, entering wedge to expand support for the movement. And Kentucky had been known as a place of great potential. 1838, Kentucky, some very few Kentucky women had the right to vote in school elections as early as 1838. So Kentucky was seen as especially ripe, a good place to begin to make inroads into the South.
We're going to hold that thought about Kentucky being one of the leaders in what was happening, or some of the areas of Kentucky. And as I move to you, Martha, so often when we talk about the women's suffrage and we say women and this 19th Amendment, it really is about looking at what happened with white women, because African-American women's stories are either have been left out or not fully included. Now, in both of your colleagues here, they have talked about those influences, but you take us even further in more depth. And so where does the context begin for you in your story?
Well, interestingly, in part, it begins also in Kentucky, in Danville, Kentucky, because I begin this book by tracing the stories of my own foremothers who descend from an enslaved woman in Danville and are still there in 1920 when the city of Danville faces the question, will women vote? Which women will vote? And so I visit that city as a way of trying to find my great-great-grandmother and her daughter who are there in Danville, and to understand the ways in which the prospect of Black women's votes is not only vexing, it generates fear in a city like Danville. The prospect that Black women will come to the polls and tip the balance of power between the political parties is part of what animates the months leading up to registration in the fall of 1920. But in order to tell that story well, I had to pull much further back in time. And so Vanguard begins in the early decades of the 19th century. And what I'm interested in is understanding why Black women come to voting rights. What are the values, the visions, the goals that African-American women have, even before they become voting rights activists, as we recognize them in the 20th century. And one answer is that they first have to be people of ideas. And so I look at some remarkable figures from the early 19th century to begin this book and introduce the critique that African-American women level at American politics from very early on. And that is the distinct critique that neither race nor sex should have any part in arbitrating political rights and political power. And while for Black women, for much of my story, that is a lonely struggle. They are oftentimes alone in fully espousing that view. I think today we would say that it was a set of ideals that have become part of our 21st century sensibilities about American politics.
Wow. Oh, as I was reading and looking at all of what you did, I just saw today, just smacked me up in the head. It was like, wow, so many things that we can learn from that. And before I go there, and as I talk, if you have comments and you like me, like, hey, I got to say it before I forget, please feel free to do so. But Elaine, I wanted you to sort of, you framed your story by 3 specific viewpoints that you gave to us. I'd like for you to frame them. I thought it was a really effective way of helping us then to look at some of the the story about what happened. Because when we think, like I think you said, when we think of the women's suffrage, we think of a few people where somebody signed a little thing and a few people waved a sign, and then everybody went happily ever after. Not. Talk to us.
Not at all. Yeah, that whole idea that women were, it was, easy, it was polite, it was decorous, all false. And so I did want to show what it took to even get to the point of a 19th Amendment. And so I was lucky enough to find three characters who are there in Nashville in the summer of 1920, and they represent three different viewpoints of this question. And I was thrilled to find, reading the newspapers in Nashville for every day of that period, to find that they arrived on the same night at Union Station, Nashville, which, gift to a writer. And these three women were Carrie Chapman Catt, who is probably the most well-known woman possibly in the world at this time. She's head of not only the National American Women's Suffrage Association, the largest mainstream suffrage organization. She is also the president of the International Women's Suffrage Alliance, reminding us that this is not just an American question. This is the idea of women's right to vote is being debated around the globe. And so she is a very, very well-known figure. She is the protege of Susan Anthony. She's come up the ranks. She's in her second presidency of this mainstream group. And she arrives reluctantly in Nashville to lead the strategy for getting ratification through the very, very not promising Tennessee legislature. Arriving also that night is a young woman, a daughter of Tennessee, who has left the mainstream movement. She's in that third generation of suffragists who is just tired of waiting, tired of putting her future on hold, tired of being polite, and she has left the mainstream and joined the more radical group, which is the National Women's Party. And she's sent by the president of the Women's Party, Alice Paul, back to home to Tennessee, and she's going to direct the Women's Party campaign for ratification. So you have two women's groups, same goal, different staffs, different approach, and bad blood between them. And then the third woman, who is my main character, is Josephine Pearson, who is the leader of the Tennessee women opposed to women's suffrage. So here she brings the ideals of the aunties, those women who opposed their sisters getting the vote. And we'll see the rationales, which unfortunately are still with us, of why they were against suffrage. And you'll see them weaponize the racial issue in their fight against women's suffrage. So by telling the story through these three women who represent three different approaches to this debate, we get to know what was going on, what were the stakes, both personal and political, at this time in 1920.
That sets it up. So
Yes.
What was Laura Clay doing during this time? Melanie?
In 1920, in August, well, she's arriving not on the same day as the others, but she comes a little bit later, and she checks into the Hermitage Hotel, where all of these figures are staying and mixing and mingling with legislators, and Elaine paints the scene wonderfully. You provided great material for me to draw on.
Good.
And Laura Clay gets there, and she very stoically rides the elevator down and joins the anti-suffrage forces and reports to duty with Josephine Pearson. And for better or for worse, her enemies become her allies there at the last stage in the game. And, you know, the women that Clay had worked with on a national level, on a state level, even people that hadn't really followed the suffrage story that closely were shocked by this defection. I mean, for Miss Clay to leave the suffrage ranks like she did, it was almost unthinkable. It was just people, I imagine them scratching their heads and wondering how this could happen. So for me, that was a big part of Kentucky's story. Although I didn't want it to be all about Miss Clay, I wanted it to be about the many men and women in all corners of the state, Black and white, all who were working for or against this movement to better understand how it happened. But Laura Clay, you can't help but get sucked into her story here.
So she starts one way and defects after she arrives.
Well, no, she had been going that direction for several years. And, you know, looking back, I find evidence that she was okay with a federal amendment early on in her suffrage career. She supports the idea that this is going to either happen on a state level, federal level, either way, she's okay with it. I think it's partly because she doesn't think a federal amendment will ever be possible, considering the southern states and their attitudes. Mm-hmm. But by about 1913, 1914, there was another very influential southern suffragist, Kate Gordon, who they become very close, Ms. Clay and Gordon. And so I think she starts to move in that direction after about 1913. But there's more to the story than just you might imagine. I think it's partly personal, partly about race. There's a lot of factors here that go into leading her away from the movement she had helped to build.
And what about that, Martha? What about race? Because we hear these stories of women. I assume that Black people and Black women weren't just sitting by and watching. You used the term intersectionality when you talked about the perspective, and I thought that was a really powerful one. So I'm tossing that out to you, and however you want to respond.
Superb. Well, thank you for that. You know, yes, today in 21st century parlance, we would characterize the women I write about in Vanguard as bringing an intersectional approach to American politics. That is to say, they neither think of themselves as women nor as Black people, but as Black women who bear a distinct set of burdens, but also have a distinct set of aspirations for American politics that, yes, includes winning women's votes, whether it's at the state level or by a federal amendment, but also always includes defeating Jim Crow, winning anti-lynching legislation, and more. And so African-American women in 1920 are organized, for example, under the auspices of the National Association of Colored Women, 300,000 Black women from across the US who are suffragists, many of them, but are not only suffragists in their politics, and build a multifaceted political movement that by 1920, the moment we've been talking about, is reorganizing its resources now to prepare African-American women, particularly in the US South, to overcome the hurdles that are going to be set in front of them in the fall of 1920. There is no secret, but that Black women will now confront poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses, and more. And so I find Black women in this same moment we've been talking about in suffrage schools and traveling to get one another prepared to register, knowing that they're going to encounter a lot of very intentional resistance that the 19th Amendment, by its very terms, allows for. There's nothing in the 19th Amendment that aspires or aims to overcome the racist laws that are going to keep Black women from voting in the individual states. There's nothing in the 19th Amendment that is going to curb the intimidation and violence that is already keeping Black men from the polls. So Black women are at work already anticipating ratification of the amendment and working together in an effort to overcome those barriers.
Thanks. As a reminder to our listeners, the Civil War was a huge event that just disrupted everything, all life in the US, and how you're going to be and what's happening. And that impacted upon all of your stories. And it does when we think about the US. And particularly after the Civil War, right after that, we have the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. And those are really to provide citizenship and to restore or to provide the ability for African Americans or Black people at the time to have the same rights or to be afforded rights that they had not received as enslaved people. But there was no backbone in terms of implementing these amendments. So the 15th Amendment gave the vote to Black men, which before, as several of you mentioned, it was only held by white wealthy or white landowners, men, landowners who were men. And then they said, well, let's add it to the Black men. And then at 13th Amendment, they're supposed to have Black people citizenship. But it was written on paper. When it came to implementing it, it wasn't happening. Till 1965, right, with the Voting Act for us to have something in place to help to implement these laws that had been set apart. So what you were talking about, Martha, and the Black women working together, it's looking at the long haul over, you said, was 200 years?
Well, my book definitely covers 200 years, takes us right to 2020. But I think you're spot on to signal that the story for African American women, while the 19th Amendment is a milestone, it is hardly the end of the story. They are going to be left, in essence, to build a new movement for voting rights out of the wake of the 19th Amendment. That is a battle they will wage with African American men. It will include a litigation component led by the NAACP. It will include the ground game of American politics. Black women will still do the work of getting registered when they can, casting ballots when they can after 1920. And then, of course, there is the necessity of the modern civil rights movement and the voting rights push that comes really from the grassroots to, in essence, compel Congress and Lyndon Johnson to acquiesce to federal legislation that Black women had been calling for since 1920. They were looking in 1920 for federal laws that would give teeth to these amendments that were on the books, but were being overridden by the states. It will take until 1965 to secure the Voting Rights Act.
Yes, as you all are talking, I'm saying, women power. Okay, I had a moment there. Just women power. Elaine, even when I was reading your book, you talked about what we perceived as just a moment in time, but years and years of the women working to gain this right to vote, even to 1920, and that the people who died who never got to see fruition of this, and people who started the movement and who were not there, who started in the movement that was already there. We talk a little bit more about the story and particular things that stand out to you that we as listeners need to pay heed. And I would ask the rest of you too, as we think about, because I think all three of the stories that you share are profound for us today, right now.
Well, Kathy, the movement going just up to 1920, and this says this will continue way beyond to the present day. This idea of expanding our democracy is not over. Was not over in 1920. Isn't over today. But looking back, what the suffragists had to do, I think we have to recognize that the fight for the franchise, for the right to vote, was not just a political debate. It was also in tandem, or perhaps even more fundamentally, a debate about women's role and women's rights in society and in our democracy. So what the suffragists have to do before they can even hope to change the laws is to change hearts and minds. change the idea of that women should only be at home with her children, that women should not have higher education because if accepted medical wisdom of the time in the mid-19th century, if a woman was forced to think too hard or study too hard, all of her blood flow would go to her brain and would starve her reproductive organs.
Lord have mercy.
And
I'm sorry.
oh yes, and this would actually endanger the entire species. So don't let women go to college, don't let women vote. And so you have what Susan Anthony calls a campaign of organize, educate, and agitate. And they had to change this hearts and minds. And it means around the country. It means going into small towns. Susan Anthony even goes into into churches in the South, 1895. She's doing some other things that are not as laudable, but they are organizing and they are educating both men and women, because women had to be convinced that they needed and should want the vote. And so this process of what we might have called consciousness raising has to proceed before they can even start with the state referenda, where of course only men can vote. And so it's an educational campaign and an organizing campaign. And then it also really is shaking up the whole idea of what women should do in the political sphere and whether she should have a voice, a vote. And so I think if we realize that this was much more than just a political debate, then we see how difficult it was. It's sort of like what we call the culture wars today. There's layers of passion and religious conviction and social idea of how the world should work, how the family should work. There are all these anti-suffrage broadsides, which are really disturbing, and this shows women being clamped down, her mouth being shut with nails. It shows women abandoning their families if they're allowed to vote, and men being emasculated by this. This whole idea of whether it's letting your woman be able to vote or wearing a mask, this can be emasculating. So they have to deal with all of this, in addition to the political realities of 48 reluctant legislatures and a reluctant Congress. And when you talk about congressional failure after the 19th Amendment, after the 15th Amendment, there are enforcement clauses in both of those. And Congress is tasked with enforcing that amendment. And the 14th Amendment calls for those states which deny the vote to eligible citizens, which would include Black men in 1870, to actually have their congressional representation reduced. And that becomes an issue in Nashville in 1920, when the Southern states realized if this 19th Amendment goes through and it legally allows Black women to vote, well, and then Washington peeks into our ballot box, into our polling places and says, well, you're not even going by the 15th Amendment, well, we may lose our representation. So don't pass this 19th Amendment, don't ratify, because it's going to be a can of worms. So we see Congress purposefully not doing its job in this way.
I appreciate that clarification. So it's not just a matter of the South avoiding and not, implementing the things of the amendment, but Congress itself not fully following up and doing its job. So on so many levels and layers. It goes back to that idea of culture wars that you wrote about and I saw. Would you say that Kentucky would be a specific example of what was going on all around the country, or would there be things that stand out differently or more? What's your take, Melanie, as we look at Kentucky particularly?
Well, certainly if we're thinking about race, Kentucky has its own set of circumstances. The attitudes, I think still today, Kentuckians would say we're Southerners. But the population, the demographics of Kentucky, always a little different. Kentucky had remained loyal to the Union, although I think a lot of Kentuckians after the fact kind of regretted that decision. I always say they went over to the other side, that they chose to secede after the war. So ideologically, they put themselves, they lined up with the South. But the racial demographics were always a little different here. And one thing that Kentucky movement, you were asking about lessons learned or things that struck us. One thing with Kentucky that that hit me hard as I was doing the research for this book is the danger of complacency, and thinking about suffrage as sort of a switch that gets flipped, a victory once it's won. Well, we're moving in the right direction, this steady march of progress. But Kentucky women and Kentucky suffragists really experienced the agony of defeat after winning some victories. And one victory was school suffrage. Many women thought that voting in school elections would be an important step toward expanding their rights later on. And Kentucky women in most cities had these rights by the turn of the 20th century, but they see these rights revoked. In 1901, the state legislature, after a lot of Black women come out to vote in an especially heated election for a school superintendent, Black mothers wanted to have a say in their children's education. They wanted to oust this one particular leader, and they show up in large numbers. And after that, the Kentucky legislature, the Democratic Party specifically, says that this is dangerous, having too many Black women vote. We can't control their votes in the way that we see fit, and better to disenfranchise women altogether than to see these wild cards possibly come into play. And so Kentucky women lose this right to vote and will spend practically, more than a decade trying to regain it. So once rights are won, it doesn't mean they're won for all time. And I think that's an excellent lesson for us all living in the moment we're living in right now.
The dangers of complacency. Absolutely. I'll turn to you, Martha, and you can respond on anything we've talked about so far, or continuing forward in our discussion, the things that stand out for you that you would like for readers, takeaways for you as an author and for our readers.
One of the things that I think sometimes surprise readers is how much time in a book about the history of women's votes we spend in church when we follow the trail of African American women. And really from the early 19th century forward, church women are critical for their ideas and how they are confronting and challenging the patriarchal organization of religious institutions. There is a real crucible for thinking about women's rights that emerges out of Black Methodist and Baptist circles in particular. And this means that Black women not only learn a great deal about politics within their religious communities, they struggle alongside and with men very directly throughout all of this story. Yes, there will be organizations like the National Association of Colored Women that will emerge to create a distinct place for African American women's politics. That move is never one that wholly abandons spaces like churches and civil rights organizations. In my story, sometimes men are allies, and at other moments they are adversaries. But there's no question that for African American women, the quest for the vote, the struggle over disenfranchisement is never one that is disengaged from the problem of the 15th Amendment, the failure of Congress to give it teeth, the possibility of a Supreme Court that would seem to impose it in its strongest terms. And so African American women, in a sense, learn what disfranchisement means because they are up close to the experience of their husbands, of their fathers, of their sons, of their brothers. And that will be true in the earliest years of the 19th century, and it certainly will be true all the way through to the modern civil rights era.
You know, as you were talking, I was thinking about the logo "Lifting as We Climb," which was used by particularly African-American women around the 1896, I think, when they first began. And if you could talk just a bit about what that theme meant and how it impacted what they do.
Sure. So this is the motto of the National Association of Colored Women. And while it is intended to, if you will, embody the commitment that the NACW has to Black women across the country at the grassroots, and that lifting as we climb, there's an implication there, of course, isn't there, that there's a sort of hierarchy already in place, and there's no question, but that the leadership of the NACW is disproportionately Black middle-class women. We know some of their names, like Mary Church Terrell and Ida B. Wells and others. Many of them are educators, for example. And so it reminds us that we have to attend to the tensions between and among Black women. Black women are not a monolith in this story. They do not all advocate for women's votes. They do not all agree, they hardly agree about the tactics in getting there. But the question about how to translate a set of ideas, a political philosophy that has come of age, if you will, and been promoted by elite women, how to translate that to the whole of African American women is an important part of this story. And for example, Washington, D.C.'s Nannie Helen Burroughs will lead the Women's Conference of the National Baptist Church, and there speak forthrightly about the interests of working women as juxtaposed against the interests of African American women. So it's a wonderful and inspiring motto, but I think underneath it, it's a reminder that for Black and white women alike, I think there are fissures and important alliances to be built across class lines in order to strengthen the movement for women's votes.
That's really important to know. It's not one size fits all. It is not, you just do it this way, because you have agreement throughout. It's been consistent. And I think, Elaine, you talked about that particularly with the youngins, I might say, the younger generation and their approach to protest and to the methods used to make a difference.
Right. So we see this happen in many social and political reform movements. Before this, the labor movement had gone through a similar schism. Those who got impatient, these are long-term, grueling campaigns that go on for decades. And as you know, you mentioned before, the women who begin it are dead by the time the 19th Amendment rolls around. And the women who take it over the finish line aren't born at the time in the mid-19th century. So I think we have to remember that how grueling this is. So this third generation of suffragists emerge at the turn of the century, the first decade or so, and they don't want to wait anymore. They're sick of being polite. They're sick of begging for the vote. They're willing to be confrontational. They're willing to be disruptive, where have we heard this before? They're willing to challenge the older women who are the protectors of the movement. And they're going to go their own way. And this is, they're embodied by Alice Paul, who's in her early 30s. She's actually in her late 20s when she confronts the establishment of the women's suffrage movement, says, we're going to, take it in a new direction. We're going to be much more confrontational. She's learned this from one of the more radical factions in Great Britain, where she trained. And she brings these tactics back, and these had never been used before. Picketing the White House. I have to say, when I saw the protesters in Lafayette Park this summer across from the White House, first thing I thought of was, oh my gosh, it's the Women's Party. That's where they were protesting. That's where they were arrested and hauled off to jail and then force-fed and tortured. So we see this impatience. And I think the important thing to take away from this, and they persisted for almost 2 years in picketing and demonstrating and being much more confrontational, burning Woodrow Wilson in effigy. But the thing I think we have to take from this is that that protest was important, and it gathered a lot of attention and public opinion, and Americans get very uncomfortable seeing these women being force-fed in prison. But it also had to be harnessed to that inside game, that political push and pull in Congress and in the legislatures, which the Women's Party also undertook. But it's that marriage of protest and political strategy that finally gets them over the line. And I think that's important for us to realize today. And again, when we see young representatives in Congress, young women who've been elected, confronting and challenging the status quo, even in that very established body, we see this process being recreated again.
Thanks. I'm struck as you said that about the fact that when you read these women's stories, they didn't, most of them say, I'm going to change the world tomorrow, or I'm going to be the one that goes and gets for years, passionately moving into this, and I might lose this, or they start as regular folk who have connect ideas and thoughts and experiences and make choices that takes them beyond just, from that one space. And I think that's a takeaway as well for any of us who feel like we have no power, no voice, no nothing. If you read these stories, I think you will rethink that. But I wanted to give you a chance, Melanie, also, if there's some takeaways you wanted to go. And then if there are any last minute things that you wanted to say, I think we have to wrap up. I mean, I could talk to you all day long. I know, but I just learned so much. But Melanie, please.
Well, this story in Kentucky, I think, is so interesting for what most of us have not known about it. If we know something about suffrage in the state, we know the name Laura Clay, possibly. We might know Madeline McDowell Breckinridge. She was Clay's successor as the president of the Kentucky Equal Rights Association. But we know just a few names, and that sort of stands in for the whole of the story in our mind. It's kind of an encyclopedia entry that we have planted in there, and it's flat. It doesn't have any of the detail, the complexity that this story really represents. And when we start digging in and we learn the experience of Black women who were excluded from the Kentucky movement and working through their own channels to change society. If we think about Jewish women who were part of this movement, a movement in Kentucky that is very much overtly Christian, it's middle class, it's what Laura Clay looks like and what she wants the movement to look like. But throughout the state, as you travel, as you look at small communities, you really see that there's a story in each of these little communities. And it's a very unique story with unique players, and the conflicts are different in many cases. Kentucky was a state that was part of the Bible Belt and a dry state. So temperance plays into this, and your stand if you're a wet or a dry. And so on a community by community basis, the stories are just endless that you can see, and the negotiations that happen in this march to women finally achieving the vote.
Negotiations, stories, layers. You talked about the various layers, whether it has to do with class, certainly race, certainly religion, certainly regional differences. And that's just a little piece of it. They all help to inform perspectives, choices, and where we are today. We didn't just drop in the sky. I'd like to tell my students, we didn't just all drop into the sky. Okay, this is our world. It was like hundreds of years. And the more we understand that, the more I think we become empowered to know possibilities for us. Martha, did you have anything to add? And Elaine and Melanie, as we go, in terms of, I thought you've already shared with us some takeaways, but I want to make sure that each of you gets a last spiel at all this majesty. Everybody listening to this, these women are fierce. I'm just saying. Go right ahead.
Well, thank you for that, Kathy. I think I'd say two things. You know, I'm sitting here in the fall of 2020 as we do. There's a great deal that might suggest too little has changed. And if 1920 was a year characterized by fierce voter suppression, particularly that aimed at African-American women in the American South, that is a circumstance that has experienced a resurgence here in 2020. And so we understand that some of the strategies and tactics that Black women used in 1920 still have a relevance today. You know, the ground game of politics is still one we have to play in every election cycle. And at the same time, the force that Black women have become in American politics, whether it's measured by the candidacy of Kamala Harris or measured by the more than 120 Black women who were running for Congress in the fall of 2020, that force reminds us that a great deal has changed. The Black women who I chronicle in Vanguard, the Black women who are moving politics in our own time, are nearly unimaginable by white Americans in 1920. They are almost unspeakable. And so a great deal has changed in 100 years, even if there is a great deal of unfinished business in front of us.
That leaves us with a lot of hope when you say that
I'm
even
glad.
though we can look and see some parallels at the same time, appreciate that hope, because I think that's the worst thing is if you lose hope. And you think, nothing to do. But I think in all of your texts, we'll leave with that. Elaine, any other things that you come to mind, particularly?
Yeah, well, like Martha, I see so many parallels to today. To be a little less optimistic, I see, we're still fighting many of these fights. We're still fighting about women's rights. I mean, on many, many levels. We're still fighting about states' rights and whether states can undermine progressive, either in the ideas in the Constitution, progressive laws, undermine elections. We're still grappling with that. And of course, states' rights is not just in our voting procedures, but it's also in gun control, in women's rights to health care. I mean, it's in all levels of our national discourse. States' rights are still, our federalist system kind of bakes it in. But we're also dealing with things the suffragists had to deal with, like the role of religion in public policy.
Yes.
They had to deal with clergy who railed against the idea of women voting because it went against their concept of the God's plan. And we're dealing with dark money in politics. We know that the anti-suffrage movement in large part was being financed by corporations who thought women voting for various reasons would be bad for their bottom line. So we're still dealing with many of these issues that the suffragists had to confront, and we have to confront it in a modern frame, and certainly racism foremost in that list. So I just want to say that it is different, but new manifestations of these problems are what we're dealing with today.
New manifestations, different. We keep hope, but we are not complacent because we know the story is continuing. Melanie, did you have anything else to add to this?
Suffragists in Kentucky, one big way that they hoped to change attitudes was through education. And the more women were educated, the more powerful they became. And so a lot of their early efforts, the Kentucky movement was focused on opening up universities, higher education to women, building women's dormitories so they could go to school. And I think, you know, if we're thinking about the hope, what we can do, being educated, being informed, refusing to be complacent, knowing the history, knowing the current issues, and being an informed citizen, that is carrying on the legacy of many of these suffragists.
Thank you for that. We have lots and lots of messages and ideas that you have shared with us, directions, and the best way to really move forward is make sure that you get these books. Absolutely. They need to be front and center in your library, and you pass them out to everybody you know, like I'm going to do, because of this greatness. I thank you for sharing some of your brilliance with us today.
Kathy, Martha, Elaine, and Melanie, thanks for being with us. We also want to send our appreciation to the sponsor of this conversation, the Kentucky Historical Society. And we want to thank you for joining us for this 2020 Kentucky Book Festival online event. If you're interested in purchasing one of the books discussed today, please visit our independent bookstore partner, Joseph Beth Booksellers at josephbeth.com. For a complete schedule of Kentucky Book Festival conversations, visit kyhumanities.org and follow us on social media at kyhumanities. As we close out, let's listen in on Kathy Bullock's wonderful rendition of Pass It On. For Kentucky Humanities, I'm Bill Goodman.
All the pain, all the tears, all the struggles through the years, how we suffer tribulation, pass it on. When it seemed all hope was gone, with our faith we carried on, and the Lord gave us strength to overcome. Oh, pass it on, pass it on, pass it on, pass it on. Oh, the grief of our past, tell the stories, make them last. Tell of how we made it over, pass it on. So many died trying to live. Hear the cries, I hear them still. Won't forget, I can't forget, I never will. Pass it on, pass it on, pass it on, pass it on, oh, pass it on, pass it on, pass it on, pass it on.